The screams began before dawn, sharp and unrelenting, echoing across the lonely hills of Rutherford County. 14 hours and 23 minutes of pure terror documented once in the courthouse records, and then erased. They tried to bury it. They thought that by erasing the truth, they could erase the horror itself. But horrors like this never die. They linger, waiting for the one who can finally see them for what they are. Ruth Coleman was 24, and she had been trapped for 7 years beneath the shadow of a man who believed cruelty was his birthright. William Krenshaw, the tobacco farmer, was no ordinary master. He was a man consumed by obsession, his life a mix of inherited power, unspeakable rage, and meticulous control. Every command, every glance, every flicker of a smile or scowl from him was a test. He watched Ruth like a predator studies the flight patterns of its prey, her every move, her every hope, every flicker of rebellion catalogued, measured, and stored for the moment he could crush it. But Ruth had learned. Pain had become her teacher. She had learned to survive, to bend without breaking. She understood the patterns. She knew the rhythms of his temper, the habits of his body, the hidden fears that betrayed the man behind the cold gray eyes. She had become a student of cruelty, absorbing it like a dark language, memorizing it, and most dangerously planning. The other enslaved people on the farm, silent witnesses to her suffering, had long since stopped hoping for justice. Any act of defiance meant certain retribution. But Ruth's mind was different. Where they saw walls, she saw the architecture of escape not for herself alone, but for the reckoning she intended. She studied him, noting his weakness for fire, his limping left leg, the nervous twitch that betrayed fear, the meticulous pride in his possessions. Everything became a weapon in her mind. Every insult, every blow, every stolen moment of hope the ammunition for a revenge calculated to terrify. The world outside the Krenshaw farm was oblivious. To them, the small rolling hills of North Carolina were quaint, prosperous, orderly. But behind the doors of that main house, a storm was building, a storm that would not merely lash out in anger, but in careful, relentless, psychological precision. What Ruth was about to do would shatter the idea that power was ever absolute, that cruelty could exist without consequence. And yet, even now, as the first light of that October morning touched the tobacco fields, Ruth moved silently, mechanically, like a shadow among the living. She was no longer just a victim. She had become something else entirely, a force that no man had ever measured, and no system of oppression had ever predicted. The abuse was never accidental. William Krenshaw had mastered the art of control, the kind that leaves no scars visible to the world but deep, invisible ones that etch themselves into the psyche. He didn't need to strike her where anyone could see. That was for amateurs. No, his brilliance, if it could be called that, was in the slow corrosion of hope. A meal served too cold. A door slammed just as she reached it. A promise whispered, then shattered before she could even grasp it. Every humiliation was deliberate, a lesson that power belonged to him and that resistance, even in thought, would be punished. Ruth learned to read the rhythms of cruelty as if decoding a secret language. She could tell when a storm was coming days before it arrived, adjust her movements, her expressions, her breathing to survive. But survival was no longer enough. Survival had sharpened her mind, forged a precision in observation and patience that few could imagine. Every sneer, every twisted word, every invisible mark became part of a ledger she kept silently in her mind. Crenshaw's weaknesses, his fears, his patterns all catalogued. She was no longer just enduring. She was learning him as a scientist studies a dangerous chemical, measuring volatility, predicting reactions. And there were cracks. He was meticulous, yes, but obsessive. Ruth noticed how he avoided fire, how the smallest flame made him uneasy. She saw the limp he tried to hide, the subtle tremor in his hand when he was angry. She saw how his appetite for control made him predictable, and therefore vulnerable. He thought he could crush the human spirit, but he had underestimated the precision of a mind sharpened by suffering. 7 years of abuse had not broken her. It had honed her. Where others saw only a victim, Ruth had become a strategist. She learned how to manipulate the manipulator, to bait him, to study him while pretending to be obedient. Every step in the house, every chore, every smile forced was a calculated move in a game that only she fully understood. She became invisible in plain sight, a ghost moving within the machinery of cruelty, waiting for the moment she could strike with absolute control. This was no impulsive act of anger. This was education in cruelty, studied and internalized until it became her own form of power. And the most terrifying part? She had no one to help her, no ally except her own mind. The other enslaved people could sense something different, something growing, but even they did not know the extent of her plan. She was evolving inside a cage, preparing not just to survive, but to rewrite the rules of domination entirely. By the fall of 1841, the quiet before her storm had become a palpable tension. Every glance between her and Krenshaw held the weight of unspoken understanding. She knew his every move, every reaction, every fear, and he still believed he was untouchable. By the autumn of 1841, Ruth Coleman had transformed from a hunted girl into a hunter cloaked in obedience. She moved through the Krenshaw farm with quiet precision, performing every chore with flawless efficiency, all while planting seeds of chaos in ways so subtle that no one, not Krenshaw, not the other enslaved individuals, suspected the storm she carried. Small things at first. A meal slightly overcooked, a tool misplaced, a hidden letter that could not be traced back to her. To outsiders, these were accidents. To her, they were the first moves of a long game, a test of patience, control, and psychological warfare. Her understanding of Crenshaw's mind was now intimate. She knew how he relied on absolute order, on routines he believed were sacred. And she learned to bend those routines without detection. When he checked the tobacco curing sheds, she had subtly altered the stacks so that they appeared perfect but would fail at the exact moment he needed them most. When he boasted to neighbors about his pristine household management, she made sure tiny flaws appeared enough to frustrate, enough to unsettle, enough to remind him that control was always an illusion. Each subtle act was a lesson in power reversal. He was strong, but she was clever. He ruled the body, she ruled the mind. The psychological tension between them became a game of predator and prey, with the roles slowly inverting. Where Krenshaw had expected fear, he began to feel unease. A flicker of doubt that grew with every minor sabotage. Ruth had learned the art of invisibility and misdirection. She smiled when he looked at her, listened when he spoke, obeyed when he demanded, and all the while, she cataloged his reactions, his frustrations, his insecurities. It was meticulous. It was deliberate. It was revenge in incubation. And yet, Ruth's mind was not only calculating strategy. It was also a repository for rage, grief, and memories of humiliation that could no longer be contained. Each small act of sabotage gave her a taste of power she had never felt before. She discovered that cruelty could be returned in kind, in ways so slow, so invisible, that the victim might not recognize the hand of fate until it was too late. She realized something terrifying. She could break him without ever touching him, using only the knowledge she had collected and the patience she had refined over years. The other enslaved people on the farm watched in a mix of fear and awe. They whispered that Ruth was no longer the same, that a darkness had awakened in her that could not be contained. Some feared it, some admired it, but all sensed that the power dynamic was shifting in ways none of them could fully articulate. Ruth's transformation was silent but undeniable. The girl who had endured 7 years of torment was now orchestrating the unraveling of the man who had made her life a living hell. And the most chilling truth? Krenshaw still believed he had total control. He could not yet see the shadow moving inside his household, a shadow with a mind as sharp as any blade, a shadow capable of turning cruelty back upon him with the precision of a master. By the chill of October, the atmosphere in the Krenshaw household had shifted. The air itself seemed heavier, as if it carried the weight of unspoken threats. Ruth moved like a shadow, her every action measured, every glance calculated. She had ceased being the girl who flinched at every word or raised hand. Now she was a predator in plain sight, learning to weaponize patience, observation, and meticulous precision. Each day brought Krenshaw closer to the trap she had been weaving for years, one so subtle, so invisible, that even the most cunning man would never sense its presence until the moment of his reckoning. The psychological games intensified. Ruth learned how to provoke frustration without detection. She would complete tasks perfectly, only to highlight tiny flaws in the tobacco harvest or household arrangements, forcing Krenshaw to lash out in vain. He would rage at things beyond reason, unaware that each outburst was catalogued, studied, and converted into data, a map of his weaknesses she intended to exploit. Where he had once believed he could control her, she had already begun to control him. Ruth also began experimenting with fear itself. She knew his paranoia about fire, his superstitions, his hidden insecurities. Candles were left strategically near objects he valued most, shadows cast just so, small creaks engineered in the floorboards at the precise moments to unsettle him. He would glance nervously, unsure why a chill ran down his spine, why the familiar house suddenly seemed threatening. He was the master, yet the illusion of power began to crumble under her careful orchestration. But Ruth's revenge was not yet physical. The first real acts of danger were symbolic tests of his vulnerability. She poisoned small items of food he rarely touched but treasured enough to unsettle, not enough to reveal her hand. She misdirected tools, shifted crates, subtly sabotaged machinery, all designed to make him doubt himself, to show him that control was never absolute. Every failure, every irritation, every misstep by Krenshaw fueled her growing confidence. And in those quiet moments, she reflected on the years of torment, the sleepless nights, the endless criticism, the calculated pain meant to break her spirit. She stored it all. Every humiliation became fuel. Every scar in her mind became part of a blueprint for his undoing. This was not revenge born of impulsive rage. This was revenge as an art form, a psychological symphony played with perfect precision. The other enslaved individuals had begun to notice subtle changes. They whispered about Ruth's intensity, her silence, the eerie calm that followed her through the house. Some feared her newfound resolve. Some secretly cheered it. But none could yet predict the storm she had been patiently assembling. And still, Krenshaw believed he remained untouchable, the unquestioned master of all he surveyed. That illusion, more than anything, would be his undoing. At this point, the tension is about to pivot from subtle manipulation to the inevitability of retribution. The morning of October 15th arrived like any other, yet nothing about it would remain ordinary. Ruth rose before dawn, her movements precise, unhurried, almost ritualistic. 7 years of torment had honed her into something entirely new. A mind sharp as steel, a patience measured in months, even years, and a fury contained until the exact moment it would be unleashed. Today, the lesson of cruelty would turn inward, and the man who had tormented her for so long would begin to understand what fear truly meant. Krenshaw moved through the house as always, confident, commanding, unaware that every glance Ruth gave him was part of a silent ledger, every smile a loaded trap, every nod a mask concealing the storm inside her mind. He believed he ruled completely, that she existed only to serve, to absorb, to endure. But in truth, the roles had begun to reverse. The invisible chains he believed bound her now bound him not physically, but psychologically. His pride, his arrogance, his sense of absolute control, all were now prey to Ruth's precision. She began the slow escalation. A door left slightly ajar, a candle placed near his prized tobacco inventory, tools subtly misaligned, each act invisible to the casual observer, yet each one deliberately calculated to unsettle him, to erode confidence and stir unease. He began to notice subtly at first that nothing felt as certain as it had. Tasks he had commanded for decades seemed to resist his control. The house no longer whispered obedience. It whispered caution. And here, for those listening closely, if you are willing to acknowledge the awakening within yourself, type this phrase in the comments twice. I see the hidden path. Twice. Let it anchor you. Let it mark the moment you recognize the truths they never wanted you to know. Those who engage with this awareness begin a transformation, a recognition that power is never as it seems, and that patience and strategy are tools far deadlier than brute force. Ruth's mind worked like a trapmaker's, building tension with every silent observation, every minor disruption, every psychological fracture she induced in Crenshaw's daily routine. His moods shifted unpredictably, paranoia settling like dust in the corners of his consciousness. And as the day wore on, she pressed further. The subtle manipulation of fear, the careful positioning of objects to trigger unease, the untraceable undermining of his authority. She was no longer just surviving. She was engineering the dismantling of a man who had built a life on tormenting others. The crucial truth here, what makes this story terrifying and unforgettable, is that Ruth's vengeance was not impulsive. It was inevitable. Every detail, every nuance of his routine, every weakness he had ever revealed was now hers to command. The storm that would consume him had been years in the making. And now it was close enough that even the air in the main house seemed to tremble with anticipation. As the sun climbed higher over the tobacco fields, the invisible web Ruth had been weaving began to tighten. Every subtle act of sabotage, every carefully orchestrated moment of unease, had built toward this day. Krenshaw, still convinced of his unshakable authority, moved through the house with confidence, unaware that the house itself had become a stage and he, the unwitting actor in a drama of vengeance far beyond his comprehension. Ruth's patience had reached its limit. Her mind had transformed suffering into strategy, anger into discipline, and fear into precision. The moment of subtle manipulation had done its work. He was unsettled, cautious, questioning even minor things that once filled him with pride. But now, the invisible threads of his dominance were ready to snap under the weight of her calculated retaliation. Every item of daily use, every path through the house, every object of pride had been mapped, studied, and turned into potential leverage. She moved like a shadow, invisible yet omnipresent, anticipating his every move, predicting his every reaction. The first tangible act of vengeance was quiet, almost imperceptible to anyone who might have looked. A carefully prepared meal, ordinary to the casual eye, deadly in intent, served not out of malice for the sake of killing, but as a subtle message. Control had shifted, and every pleasure he had taken for granted now carried consequences. The candlelight flickered across polished surfaces, shadows dancing on the walls like silent witnesses to what was to come. A single misstep, a slip, a distraction would now reveal the fragility of the man who had once believed himself untouchable. She had learned every routine, every predictable habit, and she used them like the hands of a clock counting down toward a reckoning. Even the smallest tremor of fear or hesitation in Crenshaw's body became a signal for the next escalation. Ruth's revenge was methodical, slow, and deliberate. It was an education in terror, a psychological siege before the inevitable physical confrontation. The house itself seemed to bend to her design, floorboards creaking at exactly the right moment, shadows stretching unnaturally, the familiar environment subtly turned against him. Yet even as she enacted these first overt moves, Ruth retained control over herself. She did not act in blind fury. She acted with clarity, with surgical precision. Her tormentor's world, which had once been entirely his to dominate, was now infiltrated by a force he could not anticipate. Every glance, every minor discomfort, every creeping sense of uncertainty in his mind was a reminder. The hunter had become the hunted, and Ruth was no longer the victim. By the evening, the tension had reached a fever pitch. Crenshaw's confidence faltered. His world, meticulously ordered, rigidly controlled, had begun to unravel. And Ruth, standing quietly in the shadows, watched as the first cracks appeared. She had become both judge and executioner in a game of her own design, a game he had never seen coming. Night fell over the Krenshaw farm like a velvet shroud, thick with anticipation. The air was heavy, charged with the invisible tension Ruth had cultivated for years. Krenshaw, exhausted from a day of mounting unease, moved through the house cautiously, sensing a shift he could not define. Every shadow now seemed conspiratorial, every floorboard a potential threat. The very world he had mastered had turned against him. And Ruth, patient, precise, waited in silence, watching the culmination of her calculated torment take shape. Her first strike was slow, deliberate, not a burst of rage, but a measured application of the knowledge she had gathered for years. She manipulated the environment, creating obstacles and distractions that forced him into errors, subtly undermining his authority while keeping herself safely invisible. A misplaced step, a candle too close, a seemingly trivial object strategically positioned, all invisible traps designed to weaken his confidence and strain his mind. Every small terror amplified his paranoia. Every uncertainty chipped away at the pride that had once made him believe himself untouchable. She knew fear intimately now, and she wielded it with precision. Krenshaw began to realize that the house, the very furniture and walls he had believed were extensions of his command, had become instruments of his vulnerability. He could not understand why, but dread had taken root in him. Every glance at Ruth revealed nothing yet everything. She moved silently, efficiently, mechanically, her obedience a mask hiding the deadly awareness behind her eyes. He did not know that she was cataloging every reaction, every weakness, preparing for the slow dismantling of the man he had thought indestructible. Hours passed like this, a tense choreography of predator and prey. Ruth did not strike with hasty violence. She had learned that true power lies in control, in the ability to orchestrate fear and suffering without exposing oneself. She had transformed years of abuse into a blueprint for justice measured and precise, allowing her tormentor to feel the creeping loss of control, the growing terror, and the inevitable reckoning. By the time dawn threatened the horizon, Krenshaw was unsteady, unbalanced, and unsure of himself. His authority, once absolute, had begun to crumble piece by piece, psychologically dismantled by the patient cruelty of the woman he had underestimated. And Ruth, standing quietly in the shadows, felt the power she had long been denied finally coursing through her veins. This was no mere revenge, it was education in dominance, a demonstration of what happens when patience, intelligence, and suppressed fury are wielded as weapons. The final act would come slowly, inevitably. She had already begun the transformation from victim to sovereign, from hunted to hunter. And when it arrived, Krenshaw would understand, in every bone and nerve, the cost of underestimating the mind he had tried to break. The morning sun crept across the Krenshaw farm, but the light could not touch the darkness that had settled inside the main house. William Krenshaw, once a man of absolute power and unshakable authority, now sat broken in ways no wound could reveal. Every ounce of confidence he had once wielded was gone, replaced by the creeping, gnawing awareness that he had been outmaneuvered by the very person he had sought to dominate. And Ruth Coleman. She stood apart, quiet, unbroken, the embodiment of patience transformed into vengeance, suffering transmuted into power. The final act had not been a single blow or an impulsive strike. It was slow, deliberate, and merciless, a dismantling of a man's control, a carefully orchestrated collapse of dominance accumulated over decades. Krenshaw had tasted fear, confusion, uncertainty, the very psychological poisons he had administered with precision for years. Ruth had mirrored every cruelty, inverted every tactic, and amplified it into a living nightmare. By the time the first witnesses, neighbors, and workers arrived, the evidence of what had occurred was impossible to ignore, yet incomplete. The horror lay as much in the methodical patience as in the act itself, a lesson etched into the memory of anyone who dared to know the truth. Ruth's revenge was more than personal. It was a statement, a revelation of the hidden truths of power, cruelty, and resilience. She had demonstrated that domination is never absolute, that those who wield fear without conscience are vulnerable to intelligence, patience, and the relentless force of the human spirit. Her actions sent shockwaves, not only across the farm but through the consciousness of anyone who would later hear the story. The courthouse records, the official documents, the attempts to erase history all failed to bury the fundamental truth. Cruelty always leaves cracks, and patience can become a weapon far deadlier than brute force. For Ruth, the aftermath was quiet but absolute. She was no longer defined by the years of suffering, no longer constrained by the tyranny she had endured. The chains of submission had been replaced with mastery over her own mind, over the environment that had sought to crush her, and over the man whose life she had meticulously unraveled. The story of her vengeance became a hidden lesson, buried in whispers and vanished records, a warning that the world of dominance is fragile, and the underestimated are never as powerless as they seem. And for you, the observer, the lesson is darker, more compelling. The structures of control around you, the manipulations you endure, the invisible forces shaping your reality, they are not invincible. Knowledge, patience, observation, and calculated action can turn the tables. The forbidden truths you uncover are dangerous because they awaken you. They are dangerous because they change you. If you remember nothing else from this story, remember this: power is never granted, it is seized. And once you see the cracks in the system, you can never unsee them. If you can handle truths they never wanted you to see, comment, "I see the hidden path," twice to awaken your awareness. Share this story with someone ready to uncover the dark forces behind history. They'll thank you for opening their eyes. Subscribe for more hidden chapters of history and forbidden knowledge that changes how you see the world.